Hey there, John.
Howdy, Ryan.
And welcome back to the Socratic. So we are going to be discussing, we're going to continue our discussion of Donella Meadows' leverage points, places to intervene in a system. She is listing through her 12 leverage points that can be used to change a system from within. And we worked our way up to number 8, the strength of negative feedback loops relative to the impacts they're trying to correct against. So, any system, I think as we've kind of touched on before, we got she creates this symbolic model of a system where you have the state of a system, right? So all the stuff inside of it. You have inflows, things that are going into the system, and that's stuff that's being added to the state of the system. You have outflows, things that are leaving the system. That's stuff that is being removed out of the system, and then from the state of the system, you can notice discrepancies, and then you can change what we're adding to the system or what we're taking away from the system so that the state of the system better aligns with the goals of the system. And one way to have these changes occur in a system is through the use of negative feedback loops. And negative feedback loops are pretty common in nature, natural systems, and in human systems. So one example that she gives of a natural negative feedback loop is homeostasis in the human body, right? So if you get to a temperature that is out of the norm for the human body, then the human body has ways to bring you back into equilibrium, right? So, for instance, if you get too cold, right, everyone knows that your body starts to shiver, exactly, and those muscle contractions will produce heat that will warm you back up internally. So your body, the system of your body, has an ideal state, which is a particular temperature it wants to be at, and when it moves too far out of that state, then a negative feedback loop kicks on, so that changes are made to the system to bring it back to that original state. So a negative feedback loop will take a signal that the system is moving too far out of equilibrium or out of the norm or out of the desired state of the system, and then click on a mechanism to bring it back into line to stop it moving in that direction. And then what else? She's also got an example of this in a
House.
In a human made system, right? So a thermostat is going to do the same
Thermostat,
thing.
yeah.
Obviously, rather than in a human body, it's for a home or for a building. Again, the thermostat is what senses what the temperature is, and once the temperature moves too far up or down out of the norm or out of the desired state of that system, the desired temperature, then a new mechanism is going to get kicked on to bring it back down or up to that originally desired temperature, right? So the thermostat is going to read the temperature, and if you have it set to 68 and our temperature falls below that to 65, then that's when the heat kicks on, right? So the furnace will fire up, and then heat will be brought into the house. That'll be the inflow into the system until it gets back up to the temperature of 68, and then that can kick off and then wait until the system becomes out of equilibrium again before that negative feedback loop kicks back on. So again, we find these in natural systems, biological systems, and we find these in man-made systems. And yeah, so in any system, they're a useful tool to keep the state of the system relatively consistent despite external forces or internal forces disrupting that state of the system.
And just specifically in that, she gives kind of like what the requirements are for a negative feedback loop.
Yep.
And in the thermostat example, the goal is whatever you've set the thermostat to. So
Yep.
like because the thermostat needs, or I mean, a feedback loop, negative feedback loop needs a goal.
Right. So for the
Which is
thermostat,
like
that's the
set.
temperature setting, right?
Yeah.
So
Like the
that's you setting it at
68 or
68.
whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. And then a monitoring and signaling device to detect excursions from the goal. So that's obviously when the thermostat detects that like it got colder or hotter. and
Yeah.
then a response mechanism, and then that's the furnace or the air conditioner or heat pipes or whatever. So yeah, those. So it's you need the goal, you need a monitoring system, and you need a response mechanism.
Yep. Yeah. 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 So, which is kind of interesting to think about because every system, either intentionally or unintentionally, is going to have goals, right? And then obviously we'll have mechanisms to bring it back into alignment with those goals. Um,
Some other feedback loops that come to mind, like in nature, because obviously, like the one with the thermostat, it's like very obvious, like who's setting the goal, the people living in the house. That one's like pretty simple, but there can be, and that would obviously be pretty intentional, we would assume, because probably people have a certain temperature that they feel comfortable at or whatever. But then, from like a natural standpoint in the environment, sometimes maybe you'll get like for various reasons, it's not quite so intentional with this ends of how it works out, to my understanding. See, the biology expert can correct me if I'm wrong, but you might get like a boom in a population of like prey animals for one reason or another. Maybe more mild climate or something, more food available, so they have more babies that make it to adulthood, whatever.
mm-hmm.
And then there will be a sense that even though like it's not like nature is like some type of like intelligence exactly that's like actively doing this, but as a result of this like booming prey population, then there will be more predators that'll be like kind of born and stuff too, because again, more food available, and then that will kind of like help be a check on the population of the prey so they don't run away and overproduce or whatever too. So
Yeah, or even if you're talking predators, right? You can have an overabundance of predators. If they have a boom, then they'll outconsume their
right,
prey, and then
yeah,
the lack of food source will then
they'll
be the
starve or
mechanism
whatever.
that exactly
Yeah,
disrupts their population, brings them back into a lower
yeah,
population that is perhaps closer
yeah,
to the equilibrium they started at.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting. All those things occur naturally, and obviously we haven't talked about feedback loops. Feedback loops is a part of is the seventh leverage point, and so you both negative and positive feedback loops occur naturally.
And it doesn't seem like there's
Hmm.
necessarily like an active goal that's being set necessarily with those, right? As opposed to something that has like human intervention or whatever, like with like the temperature of like the thermostat, because it seems like it's not like somebody in there's no like intelligence that's out there going, oh well, now we've got too many prey, so we gotta up the predators, and then like, oh, now we have too many predators, like, you know what I mean, like that almost just would kind of like appear to like occur. So I'm also kind of curious, I guess, does that no longer, like, what would be the goal, I guess? Like, I mean, obviously I guess we would say broadly that there would be some type of parity or equilibrium perhaps between predators and prey, but um that's not like necessarily like a, I guess I'm thinking like obviously when it comes to like hunting, right? Like typically some group of scientists or somebody that works with like the state with like the parks department or something will kind of do some research, right? And they'll like set a certain number of like tags for like the upcoming season that are available to hunters to buy, right? Based on, are there too many deer? Are there too few deer? Whatever. And they'll kind of set that. That's like easier to see because that's kind of like human, like outside sort of intervention where they're the ones kind of looking at the state of things and then making that call. But obviously, where it's like a very specific goal that's like being implemented by a human because they don't want the deer population to explode or to drop too far or whatever, right? But like I guess um with just like a natural like kind of negative feedback loop, it's like I'm not, I wonder what the goal exactly would be or how that would.
That's kind of what I was processing as well, which is like, I guess there's a question of like, why are some things going to end up being negatively fed in their feedback loops versus positively fed, right? And again, we haven't talked about positive feedback loops, but those occur in nature as well. So it's kind of, yeah, so I agree. There's like it's a good question. How does the universe without intention possibly could set parameters, right? So first of all, with the positive feedback loops, I guess so all many times negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops are closely entwined, right? So if you think about your example with the prey population, right? So if their food is abundant, they're going to begin having, they're going to survive
More
longer,
offspring.
have access to more energy resources and produce more offspring, right? And if that occurs, then the next generation will have more offspring. And if they still have access to that same additional access to resources, then they will create more offspring. But now there's more of them, so that will give us even more. So we'll get that like exponential,
like almost exponential,
that
growth,
geometric increase there, right? And that's a positive feedback loop. But eventually, that's going to hit what we'd call an inflection point, where they run up against the constraints of other resources, such as the predators catching up in their own population, or outstripping the natural resources of their food supply, right? And then that's when that turns back around and eventually starts plummeting. So the positive and the negative feedback loops are often pretty closely entwined, which is interesting. One will beget the other. And it's the same thing. So like once you hit that peak, right, and you start dying off, then you're going to have a geometric decay downward, right? So that's going to be a positive feedback loop. Just the positive feedback is a reduction in population, which is going to, as you start losing population, is going to start accelerating, right? So, yeah. What was the question we originally started out with?
Well, I guess just like, because she says like any negative feedback loop needs a goal, but it's like, but what, from nature's standpoint, like what is the goal? Like we can't get more than X amount of, sparrows or something, like, but again, it doesn't feel like it's, like humans, I guess, like we set a goal, right? Like the thermostat example is like an obvious, easy one. It's like, we put it on like 70 degrees. Right.
And you can observe the person pressing the button.
Right.
That is the creation of the goal, right?
And it's like very specific, right? So as soon as it drops it doesn't actually drop to 65, right? Before as soon as it drops to 69, it's going to kick back on or whatever to heat back up, right? Or if if it's going the other way in the hot months and you want to cool it down to 70, right? As soon as it goes to 71, it's going to go that. But it's like,
just a quick note on that. That is like the constraints of those parameters before the negative feedback loop kicks in is not like, that seems like it's a fine grained like difference, fine tuned, right? But I mean, you could have, I'm sure you could have thermostat systems that offer a wider range of acceptable conditions between the preset temperature and
like don't kick back on until it goes back down to 65 or something or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's dependent, but I guess even on the system itself, right? On the signaling, the monitoring device.
That's true. Yeah, but I guess like even then, that still feels like there's like, okay, like somebody is still like programming at, like, I don't know if she's just talking about these like feedback loops with this particular thing was in regards to systems. If this is more of like a human like driven one as opposed to just something in nature, because because it's like in nature, it feels like the goals are a little bit more obscure or like obfuscated or maybe not like immediately like apparent, or like is there even like an exact, like once the sparrows got to like 1,000,001 it like kicked in something to to take it back down, or like is it so discrete, I guess?
Well, exactly. So like so this depends on a little bit on the measuring device, right? So first of all, a thermostat probably isn't going to be a thermostat is only going to be as precise at measuring the temperature as it is precise at measuring the temperature. So what I mean by that is how, when your thermostat reads 68, right? What does that mean? Does it mean that it's 68.000 degrees? And if it went to
Right.
68.0001, it would read 68.001?
Right.
Because that's probably not the case, right? It certainly wouldn't read that.
Yeah.
But the real question, I guess, is despite whether or not it reads that, would it register that small difference, and would it then kick on due to that small difference? And probably not, right? So probably we're looking, would it kick on at 68.1? Would it be able to register 68.1? It might be able to register 68.1. It probably isn't set to kick in at that point, right? But there's some like difference. So the measuring device, whether it's natural or whether it's a man-made mechanical system, is only going to be so precise. And so there's going to be a gray area where the negative feedback doesn't kick on, right? And for our thermostat, depending on how it's built and depending on what its parameters are, that could be plus or minus 1 degree, right? So if you have it if you have it set to 68, maybe it kicks on to 69, kicks on the cooling at 69, or kicks on the heating at 67, right? If it's an older thermostat, perhaps it's less good at reading what the temperature actually is, right? So maybe when it says 68, it's not super precise, and maybe it's could be kind of like 68.9, still reads 68. And that means that by the time it reads 69, maybe it's like, almost 69.9. It's almost 70 at that point. And that's when it kicks on. So like there's that creep of, depending on how good the system is at measuring what's going on, how precise it is, and it may be better or worse at keeping it within within those parameters, right? The worse it gets, then the wider those conditions are. And then the wider those conditions are, perhaps, depending on the system, you now allow some ability to break out and get into a positive feedback loop or something. What else was I saying? Okay, so there's that gray area, right, in which you're still within the parameters, right? And so I guess this is kind of what happens in nature, where the parameters are basically set by the ecosystem, right? So if we continue on with the rabbits example, right, the parameters are set by the ecosystem, such that, with the amount of food available and with the prey that exists within that area, there is a certain amount of rabbits that can be handled, that can be sustained within that ecosystem, right? So, and that's kind of set by their surroundings and the environment around them, right? The ecosystem. Once they go above that, that's when negative feedback loops kick on, because now they've exceeded the parameters, the constraints, the capacity of their ecosystem, right? So there's not really intention there, but there still is a setting that is being kept, right? And then I guess just one more point, which is that we as humans, I think you and I like to talk about this a lot, we like to think of ourselves as separate from nature, right? But realistically, we're another aspect of the natural world, right? We think we have free will, and we think that we can make decisions for ourselves, and we have agency, right? But those decisions are ultimately things that are arising from other agents within the system. Just like the rabbits, we're also part of the system, right? So when we make decisions, we are making decisions to set parameters that then become part of the system, because we're also part of the system. So I guess when we think about like the number of tags you can put out there for hunting, right? That the fact that that's being set at a certain number based on the constraints of the ecosystem, right? It's going to be a smaller number if the deer population is small. It's going to be a larger number if the deer population is large. We're almost following those natural presets right there when the wardens set those that give that number of tags, right? They're looking at what does this ecosystem sustain, right? And that's one measure they're taking into account. They're also overlaying on top of that probably some other goals, like like how many deer do we want near people's homes, and maybe we want to constrain it further than like the ecosystem would constrain it on their own. So we add on top of that a few more goals. But again, those goals are layered on top of goals the system already had that were natural, and then humans layered them on top of there. And whether or not you want to consider humans as outside of nature or as like a new force there, I think that's kind of like debatable.
Yeah, I guess that that makes sense, kind of. Um,
I don't know if it does.
yeah. She also mentions that a complex system usually has numerous negative feedback loops.
Yes.
So that's the other thing, I guess. Like especially with like a natural system, is it's not like the controlled system of just being inside of a house with like a thermostat. That there's going to be other, things that could come into play that could, be that could impact on something.
Yeah.
She brings up the and that some of the loops might be like inactive much of the time, but they're there for like emergencies, like the cooling system at a nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
Um, so they're like only gonna like kick in under like, you know, kind of the worst like circumstances or whatever. Um,
And I think she goes on to say that, like, one cost cutting measure in a system could be to get rid of those emergency
yeah, emergency
mechanisms, right?
things. Yeah,
Yeah. And they're going to have some amount of cost to sustain, right?
right.
And so you can strip them away and you can
Yeah,
show that you're saving costs in the short
yeah,
term. However,
yeah,
eventually you're going to run
yeah,
into an emergency scenario where it'd be better to have
yeah,
those negative feedback loops available than not
yeah.
to. Um, and
Yeah, she
so,
calls it one of the big mistakes that you can make is to strip away
right, right.
those like emergency like response things. Yeah, because yeah, because she says in the long term we drastically narrow the range of conditions over which the system can survive. Like obviously, if a nuclear power plant melts down, like there's going to be a lot of far-ranging consequences from that. That'll probably override the money that we saved along the way by getting rid of the cooling features of the plant or whatever, right?
Right, right,
Um,
exactly, yeah.
yeah, and she also does bring up that like encroaching on habitats of endangered species because oftentimes, while in the short term maybe that benefits humans, more housing or more whatever it is that we're putting in, perhaps. But obviously, in the longer run, if we end up losing whole species, that can have like knock-on effects in sort of like a, I guess like a butterfly effect sort of way, right? That it's not immediately easy for us to quantify or even like maybe like realize, but then down the line that could have like quite potentially quite drastic impacts on how we do things. I'm thinking a little bit here in terms of we waged quite the war in the last, let's say, well, several decades at a minimum on insects of various varieties through the overuse of insecticides and stuff like that, right? In our industrial agricultural production. Um, and I mean, this is something actually is something I do like remember from my own experience as a kid, which is like wild when you can see these kinds of things start to happen like in the course of your own lifetime. I don't know if you had a similar experience with this or not, but growing up in Austria, I remember when we used to take like a long drive in the 90s when I was like a kid, like, by the time we would get done, the windshield would be like kind of covered in like bug splatter, for lack of a better way of putting it. I remember like we used to have to, you'd stop at a gas station, you'd have to
Yep.
get out the
Squeegee.
scraper and the squeegee and get remove all these like, and it was like a real thing you had to do like every time you took any kind of trip, certainly out through like the countryside or whatever of any kind of sufficient distance or duration. This would definitely be like a very common phenomenon, and yeah, I have like very very vivid memories of this as a kid because you get to the gas station, you're not filling up the gas, but you're the one out there
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
squeegee, scraping the windows back off. But then, like, in the last, it's hard to put exactly, but certainly in the last, like, 10, 15 years, certainly as an adult, as I've been the one doing most of the driving everywhere, even longer drives, like, you'll just go for hours and
100%, yeah.
you won't even hit, like, a single bug practically. And, um,
Yeah, back
And it
when,
just
so
if
we both went to the University of Arkansas. I used to live down there in Fayetteville, but when I
yeah
was there, because I live in Connecticut, or I grew up in Connecticut, but I would drive, was it 20 plus hours? It'd take me
yeah
two
getting
days
back
or
home
so. And
yeah
not once did I ever stop. This is back in 2012 to 2015.
yeah
Not once did I
yeah
ever stop because the bugs had accrued too
right
much on my windshield.
yeah
So those are days gone by. I remember the days as well.
yeah
We would do a trip here or there in my youth down to Florida.
yeah
And
yeah
same thing, as we went
yeah
down, the bugs would hit the windshield. Eventually, to
yeah
maintain
yeah
visibility, you'd have to
yeah
scrape them
you just
all
pull
off.
over
But
and
that's not the
yeah
way it is
exactly.
anymore. Yeah.
Which like on like one side, like in the short term, like maybe we could be like, oh well, this is like, oh, we don't have to spend all this time like scraping the bugs like off the windshield, like that's kind of nice. But
Less of an inconvenience, sure.
right, but then obviously if you think about the fact, like what does that indicate, what does that signal? Well, probably that we're like massively losing the number of insects that used to exist. And obviously a lot of us don't care for bugs too much, probably don't really want them on us or in our homes or whatever, but they clearly perform a necessary function in the ecosystem, even if nothing else, just as food for like birds and other species. So obviously if they're going, because they're all dying off with like all the insecticides and stuff, well, there's fewer for the birds to eat, which then means fewer birds. Like all these things have like knock-on effects, and obviously insects are also, generally speaking, our largest pollinators
Yep.
of plants. Not just bees, but a lot of insects perform essentially pollinating functions in the ecosystem. And so again, if we think that like a lot of our food obviously comes from growing things that need to be pollinated, and then even a lot of our other food eats the things that that grow that need to be pollinated, like cows and stuff. So it's like if we're having this like massive die off of insects, like it feels like at some point that's going to have like potentially catastrophic impacts back on our life, because if we're not being able to grow as much food anymore, or and yeah, I've heard people will talk, oh we'll have to build like little mini drones essentially that go out and perform those like functions or whatever, pollination, but then that's another cost that we have to, like, before we had the insects just doing it for free essentially, because like that's obviously how they made their living and whatnot, and so, but it's gonna, at a minimum, it could be more expensive. It could, I read to like lead to things like, crop die-offs and like starvation and things obviously can come along with periods of agricultural downturn and stuff like that. So there are these kind of things that that might not immediately even register, or they might seem like relatively inconsequential or negligible or whatever, but when you start to realize like what kind of signals these things represent, it can actually be quite disturbing, and it can have quite a lot of impact on us potentially, even if we didn't realize it when it was first occurring.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I think she goes on at a higher leverage point to talk about how important diversity is in a system, to
Yeah,
have
he does
access
this,
to
yeah.
different ways of problem solving or different mechanisms, so that when you do come across like externalities that require a system to kind of adapt, the broader set of information, different ways of doing things you have access to, then you have a broader set of solutions to bring to bear on the problem, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, when we lose that diversity of insect population, especially as we're getting further and further towards tipping points with climate change, and as it's important for the biosphere and the ecosystems to be able to rebound from disruptions, it seems like we're making ourselves more vulnerable by having that reduced diversity within the ecosystem. That there are just fewer insects who would be able to pick up the slack if, for instance, the honeybees died off or something because of some tipping point in their population as caused by climate change or ecological disruption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to like specifically like things like Roundup and stuff. Another great example of like corporations trying to make a lot of money and initially promising that there were no negative effects or whatever of these things. Oh, just spray this on your lawn, it kills the weeds, that's it. But then, of course, it was discovered that things, especially like Roundup, were having a massive negative population on the
Surprise,
on the
surprise.
bees.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then now and then all of a sudden there's like a rush to, but then it's like, even with things like, oh well, we'll try to correct by like putting out fines against these companies and things like that, but like no amount of like even like after the fact correcting like that like financially is going to bring the honeybees back if they're gone. So
Yeah.
it often shows like the imperfectness of even like oftentimes like the solutions that we have available to us when we're just thinking in terms of like the economics and all that, because oftentimes, oh well, capitalism, it'll correct for itself, there's the price point, something will change, whatever. But it's like, but if we lost the honeybees, like how are we going to go about correcting things? Like that's why we talk about this a lot, but it's why it's often so vital to have other considerations in an economic system beyond purely profits.
Mm-hmm.
Because at some point, there are just other things that matter, in a lot of ways, matter quite a bit more, quite frankly, than profits. If we can produce enough food to feed everybody on the planet is going to be more an important concern than how much money did we make, because if we're all starving or if a massive portion of the population dies off due to starvation, like, well, yeah, how much money we made isn't going to really be like super
Keep us warm at night. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be super concerning to us anymore if we're all like starving to death over here. So it's why it's so important to think about the ramifications of actions, and beyond just the profit consideration is always something that we harp on a lot because we think it's so important.
Yeah. So a couple of other points here.
Yeah, she talks about the markets actually with negative feedback loops.
Yeah. So she says companies and governments are fatally attracted to the price leverage point. Of course, all of them determinedly pushing it in the wrong direction with subsidies, fixes, externalities, taxes, and other forms of confusion. She says these folks are trying to weaken the feedback power of market signals by twisting information in their favor. The real leverage point here is to keep them from doing it. Hence the necessity of antitrust laws, truth in advertising laws, attempts to internalize costs such as pollution costs, the removal of perverse subsidies, and other ways of leveling marketing playing fields.
One thing that definitely comes to mind here immediately on the subsidies front is well, we talk about quite a lot too with the subsidies that are being given to the oil companies, because that is a lot of what keeps them like competitive and stuff in the in the current era with renewables. Whereas if those subsidies were pulled, those incentives would like actually go away and might actually help us move further and quicker away from fossil fuels as an energy source. But I guess too, I'm also thinking that, see, because some of this strikes me as a little bit maybe anarcho-capitalist in a certain way, of like wanting to get rid of like basically government intervention of various types. Although of course, I mean, she talks about things like truth in advertising laws, which obviously is a government which are government interventions to basically keep the market from like running amok, more or less. And obviously, that has to be an outside
everything she lists as solutions would have to be implemented by government, right? The attempts to internalize costs, like with pollution taxes, who's going to be collecting those taxes, right? It's government.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is another weird like point where she kind of is like pro some business solutions and then anti others,
Yeah.
right? And I guess as you were saying that, I was thinking about the subsidies, like, I mean, for a while at least, and probably in some respects we still are. We were heavily subsidizing some of the green energy sector, right? And that's an
Right.
attempt to incentivize
Yeah.
businesses to continue funding and develop businesses within that sector, right? So it seems like that
Yep.
would be a powerful mechanism if you recognize you have a lack, a government to go in and provide incentives there to bolster an industry. But I think
Based
that
on a
her
goal, right?
was that
Based on a goal that's been set.
right based on a
Like
goal that's
that
set.
would be like a way to like you have a goal, how do we actually get to the goal? Well, one of the ways would be to like yeah, offer like subsidies in a certain area to encourage that goal.
But it appears as if she would disagree with that as a good strategy, right? And I think it
Right.
largely goes back to her idea that a centralized organization of a system is problematic because it requires too much intervention and too much intention and attention from the central organizing entity or whatever.
Right.
And so you can't really um, and so that makes things difficult because how much energy and resources it requires to sustain those the initiatives put forth by the central organizing entity. So I guess, but then going on to her solutions, her it seems like her real solution there would then be, rather than incentivizing the green energy, you would be internalizing costs for the oil. Obviously, no subsidies. She's anti-subsidies, but by implementing pollution taxes or carbon taxes, that's how you would disincentivize the oil companies and then make it far more likely that green energy arises in its place, because now you've dampened the ability for oil, rightfully so, because now we're paying a real price, the real price of
Right.
carbon producing um, of fuel, because rather than allowing that price to be paid in the future, the tax is causing it to be paid right now, which makes it
Right.
much less of a financially viable prospect. And then
Yeah.
because of that lack there, you bolster the activity of the alternative, the green alternative energy
Well,
sector.
and I guess like also comboing that with removing like their subsidies. So it would
Right, yeah,
like hit them
removal
it
of
would hit them like
perverse subsidies,
it
yeah.
would it would hit them like twofold. But I
Right.
guess like part of me wonders here where again, if we're going to think beyond just economics, like there are times when for instance you might want to um switch or not switch, but you might want to like basically like adhere or encourage like a different kind of goal. So I'm thinking here in terms of like, a country could decide, for instance, that let's take something concerned with health. Let's say like obesity is like a problem. And so one way that you could go about combating that is there could be a couple of ways, obviously, right? You could institute something like a sugar tax or something that was going to charge more for quote unquote unhealthy foods. But you could also offer subsidies for healthy foods, right? Like, because that's typically almost the opposite of what we do now, where oftentimes the cheap subsidized food is the shit that's bad for you, like, all the stuff with all the corn sugar in it, or the
Right.
fructose corn syrup or whatever, right? Um, and because oftentimes, right, currently it's often ends up being more that the richer people, the more well-to-do people, are the ones that ended up eating better, because oftentimes the better quality food is more expensive, so it's kind of not really accessible to the poorest segments of the population, who oftentimes need it even more probably than the richer ones, because they probably also don't have like gym memberships and better access to healthcare and other things that like probably the rich honestly
And excess
have
time outside of their job to commit to health and
to
diet.
right exactly. So you could envision a scenario where like a government would want to pull on a couple of levers, perhaps something like a sugar tax. And again, the way that I think about things, I think you do as well, Like what I would do is something like a sugar tax is like all of that money, 100% of it would go into funding, you know, some type of socialized or single payer healthcare system. So in theory, if you are going to make quote unquote poorer decisions to, with what you're eating and whatever, well, you're going to pay more money into the healthcare system that in theory is going to then need to like help you at some point.
Yeah.
But also, like in my way of looking at it, you would also want to subsidize the healthier food and stuff to make it more affordable for more people. And again, that would be kind of a goal that would go beyond, obviously, a pure economic reasoning to, well, we want to, have a healthier population, which I suppose could have an economic outcome if, healthier people need less health care or whatever, right? Like,
well, yeah, I mean, this is all tied into economics in some way or another, right? And I think, so if I were to try to contort myself into her reasoning right here, I would say that you are correct that we want to remove subsidies from, from sugar production. However, I think that her framework here would be that if you implemented all of these more less intentionally driven strategies and more unmanaged strategies, like internalizing costs with a sugar tax, like removing the perverse subsidies of providing subsidies for corn and all that to produce corn. Yeah, get out of here, buddy. Bye, buddy. To produce corn syrup, and with things like antitrust laws and truth in advertising laws. So perhaps, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I guess where my thoughts are is that, like, if everyone was well educated on making healthy decisions with regards to diet, right? So if the truth in advertising, or at least the knowledge, was freely accessible, and this is where things get a little bit more intentionally managed and well deployed to the population, then the natural choice would be, so long as the costs are relatively the same, to go towards the healthy options, right? And so once you remove those perverse incentives, those perverse subsidies that bolster the corn crops to create corn syrup, then you have opened up the door for those are probably going to begin losing market share and begin losing their share of the total crops within the country, right? And as those reduce, as it becomes more profitable to grow healthier products, then it's going to be easier to grow those products, and so those costs are going to drop, right? So her framework, and I'm not saying this is necessarily correct, but her framework is that the less you have to do to manage this, the better. You want to put in some negative feedback loops that will make it easier for people to make the right decisions and less costly to make the right decisions, right? More costly to make the wrong ones. And in doing that, you don't have to worry about the subsidies because the system will kind of like work itself out. Now, I agree with you. That's probably some amount of libertarianism in there that I am not comfortable with my current framework, that the market is necessarily going to sort itself out without some more direct intervention. Though some of this is direct intervention, right? Again, the internalizing costs, the sugar tax would be a direct intervention. I guess.
Yeah, she like, it's almost like she plays both sides of the fence sometimes with this stuff because she does seem to be, right, you're reading this as she would be, in theory, like pro some type of pollution tax, like a carbon tax or whatever, right?
Which is weird because then if you look back at the previous paragraph when she says that everything's pushing in the wrong direction, the examples she lists are subsidies, fixes, externalities, taxes, and other forms of confusion.
And she calls she calls them forms of confusion. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And then the next paragraph is her solutions, and those are antitrust laws, truth in advertising laws, attempts to internalize costs, which she gives as an example, pollution tax. So are taxes bad or are taxes good? And so I guess guess
Yeah.
I'm probably with you that subsidies, when well deployed, when there's like a real need for them, they can be useful to
Right.
create an emerging aspect, emerging domain within the system that is having trouble growing itself, right? But I
Right.
guess
Well,
her
that's
probably her point is that they shouldn't be like the main tool. Taxes
right.
are a better tool. Truth in advertising laws, free information, those are all like better tools.
Yeah, and I guess, and obviously, again, I guess the problem why these are like higher up on the list probably is like kind of like the nitty gritty of like what you fund or what you don't fund, like in a budget. Like subsidies can obviously, as we know in real time because it happened, they can be like undone by the next administration coming in, right? So they're not
Right.
necessarily the best like
But so
long
so can
term.
taxes, right?
So, but that's like the thing. Yeah, all of this stuff. It feels like, I mean, ultimately, I think how all of this stuff, like to me, like a subsidy, if wielded towards a goal that I'm in favor of, a lot of this again feels subjective because it comes down to like, well, what goals are you actually interested in pursuing? It feels like offering subsidies and or some type of taxes on things that are like perceived to be more like negative, like those can be quite powerful market levers in my opinion
Sure. Yeah.
to shift like things and sometimes quite quickly, right? I mean, like Biden put quite a lot of money into and then the green energy market was like already responding even in red states. Like there was a lot like solar is like all over the place down here now because of that. So like it can change the market and seemingly like in a good potentially way if it happens to line with quality goals, I guess.
Yeah, I think now that we're talking more about this, my what I'm what in my head is kind of crystallizing is her idea that the subsidies are always pushing against the flow, right? So you have to, through force and through
Right.
intentionality, you have to continuously bolster this industry, right?
Right.
Until eventually, at some point, it no longer needs your support.
Right. Right.
However, again, if basically something like a tax, which she sometimes says is good, sometimes says is bad. So, but
Right.
but something like a pollution tax, which is like very or a carbon tax, which I
Right.
think probably her issue with taxes are more like very like specific taxes rather than like broader ones. So that will create a negative feedback loop in the system that will dampen a whole bunch of things automatically and bolster those things you want bolstered automatically
Encourage.
without having to
Right.
intentionally do incentives for all those
Right.
specific industries, right? So rather than having to do to incentivize wind, rather than having to incentivize solar, rather than having to give separate incentives
You
for geothermal.
disincentivize fossil fuels.
Right, exactly. Or no,
Right.
yeah, disincentivize and apply a new cost to fossil fuels, right?
Right.
So that now the profitability of fossil fuels
Right.
reduces, which means
Right.
necessarily that gives an advantage over there, and at the same
Right.
time dampens the thing you want to stop, right? The subsidies
Right.
only gives an advantage and is only fighting against the tide for the things you want. It doesn't have like a
Right.
broader systemic fix to
Right.
it. It can eventually yield one if you apply it over
Right.
enough time, but that's how like
Right.
most system changes operate, right? So there are more effective ways to do it and less effective ways to do it. And I think that her highlighting
Yeah.
here is if you have a broad tax or a broad truth in advertising law or something like that that will more universally and without attention from the management of the system side of things,
Right.
bring things into an equilibrium that you want. That's what you want to apply rather than
Right.
point interventions like a subsidy is.
Right. I do get that, but I guess like some of this also feels to me kind of like back to some of our beef with like a purely like anarchist kind of system, practically speaking, maybe more than even ideologically or from a theoretical standpoint, is I do feel that a lot of this stuff still requires us to sort of fundamentally assume that people might be like rational actors that are like willing to work in their own self-interest because like something like the truth in advertising laws like that still I guess sort of assumes that if like people had maybe better quality information in front of them or whatever, that they're going to choose to eat, the locally grown carrots over, the corn syrup infused Twinkies or whatever.
Well, that's the thing, right? And I think that's like probably the best example against her way of thinking here, which is that like if we just had, I mean, the way that we're framing it anyway is if you put a sugar tax in, right, and then have some truth in advertising laws, that eventually the market's going to equilibrate because people will, if costs are equivalent or if it's easier to eat healthy, then they'll choose the healthy option, right? But the human brain and our appetite is designed to crave sugar over other things, right? So basically you're fighting against our biology. And I don't know if just having a free market that is a level playing field is enough to outcompete the sugar, right? There probably is, as you said, some amount of intervention on top of that could go to make a truly equitable playing field rather than just a level one. Because if it's just the same, that everything costs the same, we still have that inclination, and some people have this exacerbated through a lifetime of sugar addiction essentially. But that's going to exist whether or not we know that this bag of spinach is better for us than this bag of Twinkies, right? We still have that craving, and so we need some way to incentivize the spinach above and beyond just these two are equivalent. Which one do I choose? I really like sugar, so I'm going to pick that one. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it feels to me like the truly powerful lever here would be like a combo of the two, right? Like, quote unquote, like, let's think of it as like a negative tax on like the bad things. And then the positive like subsidy like on the good things. Like, because now,
but if you're to choose one, what do you think is more powerful? I guess, because I think that's kind of the framing that she has here.
Right. Yeah, and I guess in that respect, I do see something like probably the negative taxes, because if you apply like a carbon tax or a sugar tax or something on all of that stuff, that it's going to make that stuff obviously like more expensive. It's going to make it at least like more easy for like the other things, whether that's green energy or better food, or like better quality food. It's going to make that like more easy to compete just right off the bat, because those things obviously won't have those added taxes. So like,
and why that's an
go ahead.
So, and why that's a negative feedback loop, right? Is because I think you're defining right there what the equilibrium point is, right? You're saying it costs this much for sugar, and then because of that additional cost, that's going to bring the sugar down and the other things up. Right? So you're redefining the equilibrium point. Whereas with the incentive, you're not doing the same thing, right? With the subsidy, you're throwing money at it, but you're not defining a new equilibrium point. And I think that's her case for why a negative feedback loop and these types of solutions are so much better than the intentionally managed solutions like subsidies. Which I think it holds some water, certainly. I agree with you that there's certainly something to be said for subsidies. I don't think she's really throwing them out. She's certainly saying that there are lower leverage points, and she probably would put them in terms of like the parameters, numbers, and constraints, like the lowest leverage point,
higher up.
And again, I think it's because they have obviously an influence, they have an impact, but for them to have a major impact, they need to be sustained and they need to be maintained over time. Whereas something like a tax or something that sets a new equilibrium, it just needs to be implemented once, and then it kind of takes care of itself, right? You don't need to keep pumping money into it; you actually get money out of it.
Yeah, but then also, right? Isn't it? I mean, we already said, like, taxes, too, can be, like, reversed. Like, the next administration can come in and be like, oh, we're not taxing, carbon anymore. We're not taxing sugar anymore.
You're right. But you don't, but like, it doesn't require any material resources to continue, right? Where the subsidies requires you to keep putting in material resources. Right? So yes, subsidies can be reversed, but the taxes are different because they don't require a continuous input.
You're not
they need to not be reversed, agreed, but they don't require like, okay, now we need to like fund it again. Now next month they got to fund it. Right, because
that's through the taxes, the money is coming like from the market, from the interactions of the system, as opposed to like us like having to put tax dollars into like certain areas. I do get what you mean about how how they're kind of like different. But I guess I also do feel like both of them are definitely still very much susceptible or vulnerable, I guess, to, you know, a new administration coming in and like reversing them or taking them away.
Right, which is why they're really not that high on the list, right?
Right,
You know,
which again,
or at least
because again, it's
the taxes are not, the negative feedback loops are not, and then subsidies,
yeah,
I think she would put at the maybe the
right,
lowest rung on the list.
right,
Yeah, but again, like, you know, so like this all kind of depends on one of the higher ones is the goals of the system,
the goals,
right? And
right,
if these don't,
right,
if we don't
which
have
is,
like an
yeah,
aligned goal, then you can go back and
right,
forth on any of these things, right? And that's why
yeah,
they're not some of the higher intervention spots in the system.
right, which I guess is like ultimately why it's like in some ways it would be better, I guess. And I think, I mean, I agree, although I think it's oftentimes difficult to get humans to do the rational thing. But obviously, if you were able to get everybody in the system to agree that eating food filled with like corn syrup is like a bad idea versus eating more like fresh fruits and vegetables and, you know, meat and things is like better, then like in theory, like the human choice like wins out or whatever because people like want to make the better decisions, and then in theory
Right.
the market would respond to those things. And I guess like I get that, but often it feels like um I'm not entirely certain that people are always aware of what the best goals are. And of course that's subjective, right? Like, you know, I mean, we think that like, you know, being healthier, you know, not being obese, all these things are like better values, and we would even probably say we think that's like objectively true based on like, you know, medical science and stuff. I mean, like
Sure, yeah.
doctors say like most everything, like, you know, losing weight is like good for pretty much combating just about everything, right? Like obesity is from like a medical standpoint like pretty universally derided, but um you know, if you had like, let's say, a greater value on like personal freedom perhaps than personal health, and to you being free to make like, you know, quote unquote a poor choice by how we would define it, that's like, you know, ultimately a better thing than like forcing people to be healthy, right? Like some people, you know, I mean, this came up actually even what recently ish with um uh Kennedy wanting to like not allow people to use SNAP benefits or whatever on
Right, yep.
like sugary drinks and things like that, right? Which again, now there becomes this like question of like freedom, and there were a lot of like liberal people that were like pushing back on what he was saying, because like, oh, you're like telling poor people like how to think, even though like certainly the two of us would probably agree that like that probably was a good goal from like a health standpoint. Like, you know, we want to encourage people not to buy like, you know, shitty things
Right, yeah, you
to
at
put
least
in
don't
their
want to
body.
provide paths that incentivize that, right? Yeah. But
Yeah.
so I agree with what you're saying, but I guess that's why this is so although I think there's some ways to read this as she's a little more libertarian than in her thoughts on this and maybe some others would be comfortable with. But ultimately, I mean these her solutions are impositions of government on the market, right? So no matter
Right.
what, we're limiting the freedom, right, of the individual. If we're going to apply like a sugar tax, you know, whoever wants to cry foul about freedom there would say like, well, why do I have to pay more for this when,
Yeah.
you know, that's what I want, right? And the reason for that
Yeah.
is that there is a cost to it, and or the reason that could be given is there's a
Right.
cost to it at the medical level, and so we're bringing
Right.
that cost into the product itself. So it actually is part of the system or whatever. But no matter what, I mean, you know, the person who wants to cry foul about freedom is not going to necessarily accept that. So yeah, although we could say that she's leans a little bit more libertarian than some other thinkers, I think she definitely has some like government from pro-government views here because all of her solutions are government interventions into the economic system.
Right.
They just are different from some other ones. And I agree with you that I
Right.
think the subsidies can be powerful, but I think she makes a good case for why they're not as powerful as some other ideas.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that she's correct that things like the goals of the system are ultimately going to be like the biggest drivers, because if you change how the entire system works or how it's viewed by the participants in the system, clearly that has the ability to make change at least a lot more easy, right? Because
Right.
you're not having to force, I guess, is maybe that's part of
Right.
this, is like anytime you can reduce the amount of like force necessary, whether that's like a tax or she even like, I guess, her comparison, between the negative feedback loops and the positive feedback loops, um, is that like the positive feedback loops are like self-reinforcing, so like they require like perhaps less intervention like actively. So I guess anything that requires like less fucking
Well,
with the
negative
system
feedback loops
perhaps.
are self reinforcing as well, right? If you have a mechanism to enforce it, then it also is, but it's just self reinforcing towards an equilibrium rather than out away from an equilibrium. So and that's
Yeah,
why
okay.
she says let's put in a tax, because that sets a new equilibrium, and then that is self reinforcing, right? In many ways,
Right.
yeah. The
Right.
change, it's self-limiting, right? I think is what she uses for a negative feedback loop, self-correcting, but it's reinforcing the equilibrium that we want to correct back to. So a positive feedback loop is self-reinforcing because as it starts it continues getting stronger and stronger. A negative feedback loop will get weaker as you get closer to the equilibrium, but is self-reinforcing of that equilibrium, right? Is a mechanism to, if you move outside the equilibrium, set it back into that. So it's just reinforcing something other than the feedback loop itself, but it is there to be a self-reinforcing mechanism within the system.
Yeah, okay.
So and so I
um
guess again towards closeout here, her second to last or her paragraph before like starting to list some examples of strengthening negative feedback controls. She talks about how it's important to have a strong negative feedback loop relative to the impact it's designed to correct. So again, it's correcting impacts to reinforce an equilibrium. And so the example she gives is if you have a thermostat system, it might work fine on a cold day, but if on like, a below freezing day, you open up all the windows, no matter how good your
yeah.
furnace is, you're probably not going to be able to heat the home, right?
Yeah, because it's
And
competing against a larger system at that point, right? Because all of the
right.
outside is a lot colder than like inside your home. So
And
like
if
the
you think
furnace
about
can't
the
heat all of the
input,
outside.
yeah, if you think about the
Yeah.
input and the input is
Right.
so large now that
Yeah.
our system, our discrepancy and our ability to change the system to outcompete that extra input is going to be difficult.
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult, right? Because the input is
Yeah.
so large relative to the system. So,
Yeah.
and I think that speaks to what you were just saying with something like reversing obesity, or correcting our carbon consumption, that these problems are so large, right, that we need not just some feedback, some negative feedback loops, but maybe some subsidies or additional tools. Like, it'd
Right.
be useful to bring all of the tools to bear on them because they're so
Right.
large and so consequential.
Yeah. Because it does feel like if you can use like multiple of like the tax in like tandem with the subsidy, feels like a very powerful lever that you could push, especially if you are trying to interject like a goal into the system of either
Right.
getting
Yeah.
away from using carbon fuel or fossil fuels, or like making people like less obese. Like
Right.
if you like combo those things together, you can absolutely move the needle, I think, quite a bit faster. I wouldn't be surprised. um, and
Right.
two, I guess you could also kind of market it a little bit like, if we had like a universal healthcare system, you could kind of point out like you still have the freedom to eat the sugary stuff if you want, but you are going to basically be paying more into the healthcare system as a result.
Right.
So that like if you inevitably end up needing it more because of your choices, well, you've also paid in more.
Right. Right.
Um, so it kind of, I guess, like balances, out in that respect. You could just like essentially make it like, hey, you're all right. You're paying your medical bills in advance now. Like if
Right.
you want
And
to
so
think
I
about it
think
that
that's
way.
her point, right? Which is that you have now made more transparent the costs
Actual
that are being
cost,
done there.
right,
Exactly. You're just
of
inputting.
eating something,
Basically, the
right?
tax is just building in the cost that should have been there anyway, right? And
Right,
obviously, in this case, those costs have to be determined by, well, how much is an appropriate tax relative to those costs, right? So there is
right,
some amount of management that's involved there, but it's not
right,
really like you're putting your finger on the scale in a positive sense. You're just trying to make more apparent what is
right.
really occurring here, right? And I think that's what she's
Yeah.
saying the difference is.
And this is also, in some ways, really, I would say, quite the point in favor of like value added taxes, right? Um, because you're like collecting them, like, as opposed to something later like an income tax or whatever that's like a little bit easier to get around, or you have a better accountant, whatever. Anytime you have like a value added tax where you just collect that at the point of like the
Point of
sale of
occurrence,
something,
yeah. Yeah.
it's way easier to get that, right? Like it's, no billionaire, no matter how good their accountants are, like you can't get around that when you're buying Coca-Cola in the store or
Right,
whatever.
right, yeah.
So it does like more to actually guarantee that you actually get those like taxes or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the other things she kind of she talks about, like, one of the weakening of another set of negative feedbacks loops is those of democracy,
Right, yeah.
because basically we've been getting rid of the self-correcting feedback between the people and the government, which required obviously the people to be informed about what it is that elected representatives are doing, and then responding by voting them out if they aren't representing our interests, right?
Yeah.
But that requires, obviously, she like says, the free, full, unbiased flow of information between the electorate and the leaders. But because the rich disproportionately spend the money on the politicians, and they can obfuscate that sort of flow of information and quite frankly contravene the will of the people, or of the vast majority of the people, then it basically creates a situation where now you've eroded those negative feedback loops, which obviously then has like larger effects on both democracy itself and the market, because obviously if our politicians are no longer reining in the market in the ways they should be because of campaign donations, then things are going to get kind of worse and worse.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah. So there's
Oh yeah, and then at the very end, she gives like a short list of some examples of strengthening negative feedback controls to improve a system's self-correcting abilities. Yeah, preventative medicine, exercise, again, which these are the kind of goals that like a government in theory could bolster by
right.
certain types of taxes and or like subsidies, or maybe even like tax breaks, right? Like I don't know exactly how this would look like, but perhaps like if there was some, and of course this would get into some perhaps bureaucracy, or people would be uncomfortable with the amount of like oversight or something, but like let's say that every time that you like checked in at a gym or whatever, if there was like some mechanism for like giving you like a tax break, in regards to like healthcare taxes or something,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
Like sort of like an incentive to do the right behavior or something like that. Would definitely. Also, I found it quite interesting that she included the Freedom of Information Act in here to reduce like government secrecy and stuff too. That was basically like all of this is about like making that like information like more readily accessible. And she also talks about protection of whistleblowers,
Yep.
which is like a very interesting one to think about as well. Yeah, and then she also kind of brings up the limits here a little bit too, right? Because she was talking about like the fishing thing. She was talking about traditional controls on fishing were sufficient until radar spotting and drift nets and other technologies made it possible for a few actors to wipe out the fish. So, because like that's like also like part of the problem too, is sometimes there's like a technological advance that like requires some new legislation or some new rules to be put into place
Right.
because like the former realities are no longer the case or whatever.
Yeah, and I think she contrasted, or that example is building on the example of like, well, a thermostat's going to work well until you throw open all the windows of the house, right? And so
Right.
her main point with this is that any negative feedback loops need to be as strong as the changes that they are trying to constrain, right?
Right.
So
Right.
if you have bigger changes, bigger forces pushing for change, you need a stronger negative feedback loop.
Right.
And I
To
guess
hold it
that's
in
why the
power or in
pollution
check.
taxes, by increasing taxes on a pollution or on sugar or something like that, that would be a feedback loop. That'd be increasing that negative feedback loop to bring our system back into equilibrium beyond, like, our natural propensity for sugar or the deterioration of the environment. What she follows up those two examples with is the power of big industry calls for the power of big government to hold it in check. A
Yeah.
global economy makes necessary a global government and a global regulations, which,
That would
again,
obviously
she's
be
kind.
very unlibertarian
Right, right.
in that
Again, yeah, she
respect,
definitely. I
yeah.
don't think she's, at the very least, traditionally libertarian or anarcho-capitalist. I think that
Yeah.
she just has an adherence to systems as having measures in place to deal with equilibria, into in that those should be either bolstered or left in place, but that obviously management of the system is good, but management in the right way. So she definitely says
Right.
some things that are kind of like clash with my frankly more socialist notions and sentiments, but I think ultimately it's not be out of a position of pro capitalism or anything like that, but kind of an understanding of her
What works
framework.
practically.
Yeah, her framework, that there are
Yeah.
some things that work better than others. And I guess,
Yeah.
she would probably argue that many of the interventions that we're more familiar with are the lower level interventions that,
Right.
if you look around, most nations, function under a largely capitalist, economic system. And so those other
Right.
interventions that we think of as perhaps more socialist haven't necessarily worked well because they're not interventions, although they're aligned with that directive of socialism or a more egalitarian economic system, they aren't interventions that work very well in changing the system, only in,
Right.
providing you something to do that seems like you're changing the system.
Or perhaps providing more buffers in the system, right? Like I feel like what a lot of the European countries, especially the Western and Northern European countries, do is they're just offering maybe perhaps more like buffers on
Okay.
capitalism than we do in the US, because they're not, like you said, they're not like fundamentally getting rid of the capitalist system, but they are buffering the capitalist system against more of like the abuses and the
Right, right, yeah.
um so it's almost, honestly, it's almost like some of the, like the stuff, we talked about with some of the earlier points with like that you could like, like one of the things that you could do to like, keep rivers from flooding is like building canals or dams or lakes or whatever. It's almost more like that I think
So you can create
they've,
welfare systems so that,
right.
when the capitalists seek to exploit the masses, there's something to fall back on. Right, right, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Or to maybe even take some of the sting out of perhaps some of the worst of the oscillations,
Right,
because
right, yeah, yeah.
in, like, for instance, in the US, where we have very little of these like social safety net kind of things, you get like a big downturn. For instance, a lot of people become homeless, unemployed, all these things. Whereas, like, at least if you have a stronger social safety net in place, um, even if maybe more people lose their job, they at least have like a few years of unemployment insurance to tide them over, or some type of guaranteed
Mhm.
housing situation or whatever, right? It's like, it almost feels like in some ways that's more what's what they're really doing is they're almost like buffering the capitalism a little bit more, whereas like in the US I feel like we have a very unbuffered capitalism. um And
You can see the difference in alignment of goals of those systems, and obviously this is jumping ahead in
right,
terms of leverage points. But
yeah,
it seems like many of those more more socialist nations or more democratically socialist nations over in Europe
yeah,
have this idea that government is there to like help people and to kind of keep the capitalism at bay to some extent. Whereas
right.
here we generally have the idea, the goal, the framework, the paradigm, whatever you want to call it, that the government's in the way of corporations. If
Yeah,
they were just given free
capitalism
reign, then
through
we'd
the
be
roof.
good. Everything would be
Yeah, yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take this capitalism to the moon. No
Let's see, as
checks,
far as we
no
can go.
constraints.
Drive past E.
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
all right. Well, do you think anything more to say?
Well, and yeah,
It's been about an hour and 15 minutes now, so
yeah,
I feel like we're getting
yeah,
longer. It's not good.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think we're a little bit meandering on this one. In some ways, as we like kind of figured out what was going on with the negative feedback loops. But I don't know about you, but
Yeah.
I'm kind of like I'm comfortable with where we landed in terms of
Yeah.
what the
Well,
what the good, the
and
benefits of negative feedback loops are, and why they're placed where they are.
and I guess like I do think that I'm coming around maybe more that it's not so much that she's like a libertarian or like some like anarcho-capitalist kind of leanings. It's more of she just doesn't feel that many of these things like negative feedback loops in this particular case are as effective at changing like a system as like other things that she'll like get to later.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not so much that she like is like against government interventions, but she thinks that a lot of them aren't very efficacious at actually
Right. Or efficient. They take a
changing
lot of
things or
efficacious
that.
and efficient.
Yeah.
They take a lot of effort but don't yield much gains.
Yeah. And I guess like that's because that is a different type of argument than
Right.
like government is bad or government shouldn't intervene or government shouldn't like do anything.
Right, which is very clear. I definitely there is some points she makes where
Yeah.
you could take that some points
Yeah.
in isolation where you could get that
Right.
sentiment from, right? But I think
Yeah.
overwhelmingly, I think we would have to reject that, especially even just that one that one sentence we
The
read
power
before.
of big industry calls for the power of big government to hold it in check.
Yeah.
A
It's
global
just right
economy
there.
makes necessary a global government and global regulations. That definitely doesn't feel like somebody that's
Which is
talking-
anti-anarcho-capitalist as you can get, yeah.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think that is also fair. I think I do have. I think a better understanding of like it's more about like what works and what's the most effective and like efficient, like you said, as opposed to government is bad or something. It's just
Right,
that maybe
right.
it's not always the best way to actually do things, but. Obviously, as we know,
Or
this world,
even if it's not, or at least there's some ways to leverage government that are better than others, right?
better than
and
others,
that
right.
many of the interventions that are generally discussed and practiced at the governmental level are some of the least effective interventions,
Right.
And so they give this veneer of government isn't effective because the strategies
Right.
employed are ineffective, rather than
Right.
government or some like external to the market
Right.
force being a useful and necessary component within a system.
Yeah, or counterweight to
Yeah.
big industry. You know, the
Yep.
power of big industry here. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that makes sense. I think so. Yeah.
All right, cool.
That
So next
was
we'll get into
28.
the gain around driving positive feedback loops, which I'm sure will also be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah. Till next time.
Very good.
Always
Sir.
make sure to read this stuff for yourself and think about it and work through it and reach your own conclusions. See ya.
All right.